I need you to understand something before I say another word. What I found that morning was not supposed to exist, and the people who buried it made absolutely sure of that. For almost 30 years, I kept this secret locked inside me because I genuinely believed some truths are too fragile to survive the wrong hands, but I am done being silent. What I discovered beneath that earth didn't just change my understanding of history, it changed my understanding of why history gets erased in the first place. And here is what I promise you. By the time I finish telling you this story, you will understand why some of the greatest discoveries in human history are hidden not to erase the truth, but to protect it. To understand why I started digging in that forgotten corner of the convent, I have to take you back to who I was before any of this began. My name is Sister Margaret. I entered the convent at 22, not because I was running from anything, but because I genuinely felt called toward something quieter than the world outside those walls. I was never the dramatic type. I was the woman in the corner of the archive room, wearing cotton gloves, carefully turning pages that hadn't been touched in 100 years. That was my purpose. The preservation of old manuscripts, the care of forgotten documents, the recovery of things that time had nearly swallowed whole. I believed then, and I still believe now, that every ancient object carries a story waiting to be told. My job was simply to listen closely enough to hear it. The convent itself sat on the edge of a small Pennsylvania valley, surrounded by oak trees so old their roots had broken through the stone walkways 3 separate times in my years there. The building dated back to the early 1700s. Its walls were thick, weathered gray limestone covered in decades of moss. There were sections nobody used anymore. A garden wing sealed after a partial collapse in 1962, a lower cellar that flooded every spring without fail, and a small eastern chapel that had been locked since before I arrived, its wooden door swollen shut and its single window boarded from the outside. The locals had stories about the convent, the way locals always do about old places. Some claimed that beneath the East Garden, tunnels ran deep into the hillside. Others said that a group of traveling monks had once stayed at the convent for nearly 2 years in the mid-1800s, and that when they left something behind, deliberately. I smiled at those stories the way you smile at folklore. Warmly, but without belief. That changed the autumn I was assigned to lead the restoration of the old East Wing. A brutal summer storm had torn through the valley and damaged the foundation of the abandoned chapel. The church sent a small crew to assess the damage, and I was asked to oversee the recovery of anything historically significant before the repairs began. I started with the obvious places: the alcoves, the wooden storage chests, the crumbling built-in shelving. Everything was damp, rotted, unremarkable. 3 days of careful searching produced nothing but mold and disappointment. On the fourth day, one of the workers called me over to the north corner of the chapel floor. The storm had cracked open an old section of stone paving, and beneath it he had found what looked like disturbed earth. Not collapsed earth, disturbed earth, the kind that had been moved intentionally and then packed back down very carefully, the kind that signals a deliberate act. We removed the remaining stones by hand, slowly. I insisted on that. Beneath them, wrapped in multiple layers of waxed linen and then sealed inside a thin lead casing barely larger than a shoebox, was a Bible. I didn't know what I was holding at first. The lead casing had no markings on the outside. I brought it into the restoration room, set it on my work table under the light, and opened it with the same slow care I gave everything else. Inside the linen wrapping, the Bible itself was extraordinary simply as an object. Handbound, its leather covered dark with age but still intact. The pages were heavy vellum, not paper, which explained how it had survived underground. The text was Latin, printed in an early style I recognized as mid-1600s at the latest, but the printed text was not what stopped my breath. Throughout the margins of at least 40 pages, someone had written by hand in a much smaller, urgent script, not decorative, not devotional, precise, coded. The handwriting shifted between Latin, Old German, and what I eventually recognized as a dialect of medieval Occitan, the language of southern France. Someone had hidden a private record inside a printed Bible. and they had done it carefully, knowing exactly what they were concealing. I spent 2 weeks just cataloging what I could read. The marginal notes described what seemed, at first, like a series of land disputes and religious correspondences, ordinary enough for the 1600s. But one phrase kept appearing across different pages in all three languages. Translated as closely as I could manage, it read, "The valley that received us when every border closed." I wrote it down and stared at it for a long time. Then, during my third week of examination, I was checking the Bible's binding for structural damage when I felt something beneath the rear inner cover, something flat, carefully layered between the leather and the board beneath it. I worked the corner free with a bone folder, slow millimeter by millimeter, until a folded sheet slid free. Vellum again, aged but preserved by the leather around it. It was a map, hand-drawn in ink that had faded to a soft amber brown. It showed a river valley, mountain ridgelines, a grid of structures I recognized as a planned settlement, 2 roads, and what appeared to be a series of underground passages marked along the hillside. At the center of the settlement, someone had drawn a small seal, a crescent, and an oak tree intertwined. Beneath the seal, in Latin, 4 words, Fidelis, Liberi, non obliti, faithful, free, not forgotten. I photographed everything. Then I started searching. The church archives connected to our convent held records going back to 1724. I had cataloged most of them myself over 15 years, so I knew what was there. But I also knew what was missing. 3 boxes of correspondence from the 1840s had been flagged as lost in our inventory as far back as I could find. Missing, not destroyed. That difference matters. And one old ledger I had always assumed was a property record turned out, on closer reading, to contain references to a settlement described as outside registered borders, sustained by agreement of silence. Outside registered borders. Sustained by agreement of silence. I brought the map to a retired historian I trusted, a woman named Dr. Cecilia Hart, who had spent 40 years studying colonial-era religious communities in the mid-Atlantic region. She looked at the seal for a long time without speaking. Then she told me she had seen that crescent and oak symbol before. Once. In a footnote of an 1887 academic paper that had been almost entirely discredited and then quietly pulled from circulation. The paper had argued that sometime in the late 1600s, a community of religious refugees, a mixture of expelled Huguenots, displaced Moravians, and a small group of Catholic families fleeing religious violence in the Rhine Valley, had established a self-governed settlement in a remote Pennsylvania valley. Not a colony, not a township. A small, functioning independent community that operated for nearly 80 years before it simply vanished from every record at once. Historians who encountered references to it assumed it was a misidentification of a known settlement. The official record had no space for it. So the official record erased it, but someone buried a Bible beneath a chapel floor with a map inside it, making absolutely certain that what the official record erased would not be forgotten entirely. The emotional turning point for me came on a Tuesday evening in October, alone in the archive room, when I finally understood what I was actually holding. This was not a discovery for me to publish. This was not a mystery for me to solve and announce. Someone from that forgotten community had trusted the future with their existence. They had wrapped it in wax and lead and buried it beneath a floor, hoping that someday someone would find it and understand the responsibility attached to finding it. That choice, that act of faith in a future they could not see, undid something in me completely. I sat with that feeling for a long time before I took the next step. Following the map required understanding its landmarks. The mountain ridgeline it showed matched a range about 40 miles north of the convent. I drove there twice before I identified the river bend drawn at the settlement's southern edge. The valley itself was now forested state land, unremarkable to any casual visitor. But when I walked the tree line at the coordinates I had calculated from the map, I found the first stone, then a second. Foundation stones, laid in a careful grid, half buried under 2 centuries of leaf matter and soil, the outline of structures, small homes, a common building at the center. and carved into the base of what had once been the largest structure, partially hidden by root growth, the crescent and oak seal, exactly as drawn in the Bible. They were real. They had been here. And they had built something worth protecting. I contacted Dr. Hart immediately. She brought in 2 archaeologists she trusted. Within 6 months, the site had been carefully documented and submitted to the State Historical Preservation Office. It was eventually designated a protected site. The community that had lived there was given a name in the historical record for the first time. Descendants were found, quietly, through church genealogy networks, people who had carried fragments of this story in family memory without knowing what it meant. The Bible was donated to a university archive where it could be properly preserved and studied. I kept nothing except photographs and my own notes and the memory of that moment when I understood what faith in the future actually looks like. What I carry now is not the triumph of finding something, it is the weight of understanding why it was hidden and the gratitude of knowing it survived long enough to be found. History does not only belong to kingdoms and empires and powerful men who wrote the official accounts, it belongs to the ordinary people who built something real in a forgotten valley and trusted a buried book to carry their memory forward. The greatest treasures are never gold or crowns. They are the stories of people who lived and loved and built something worth remembering, even when the world refused to remember them. Finding that Bible did not make me a hero, it made me a keeper of something I was given the privilege of returning to where it belongs. In the light, in the record, in the memory of the living dot. Now I want to ask you something before you go. Do you believe that every forgotten chapter of history should always be uncovered, even if it changes everything people thought they knew? Leave your answer in the comments below because I genuinely want to know where you stand on that. And if this story kept you leaning forward until the very last word, please share it. Someone you know is waiting to hear something that reminds them that the past is never truly gone. It is just waiting for someone patient enough and brave enough to listen.